Welcome everybody to my presentation today, where, as I said, I'm going to be talking about specifically community resilience, but we're going to talk about how we can build inclusive community resilience. I'm the Community Resilience Officer at GRCC. For those of you who don't know, GRCC stands for Gloucestershire Rural Community Council. We do tend to just go by GRCC now because we actually work in the urban boroughs of Cheltenham and Gloucester as well. So GRCC is a bit more of a of a sort of generic name, but I appreciate going by acronyms isn't always appropriate. So we sit under the umbrella body of ACRE, which stands for Action with Communities in Rural England. I believe Paul Dixon from ACRE has actually done one of these banter sessions before that I assisted on. So I know some of you may be familiar with ACRE's work. So for a bit of context, we're one of the local organisations working under ACRE. So just as a quick overview of what this presentation is going to cover, I'm going to introduce the work that GRCC does in Gloucestershire before talking about community resilience in a wider national context. Then talking about what inclusivity actually is and how that relates to community resilience, before identifying some points of vulnerability that communities may face in the face of disasters. And then the final bit, which I feel may be the most popular, is what steps can we take now in our community to actually try and foster community resilience. I think in this space, it's very common for people to theorize and talk about ideas, but what can we actually do to make a change today or in the immediate future? So that's what I'm hoping to focus on today. So to start off, I'm going to explain a little bit more about who GRCC are. Now, I think it's worth just saying as an overarching point, we're all about community action. We're all about empowering in the community voice, a grassroots approach, fostering the kind of collaboration between the voluntary and community sector and the wider public. And that is what all of our work kind of stems from and the work that we do. Otherwise, we can seem quite an overwhelming and broad charity to a lot of people. So we are a registered charity, and we've been helping Gloucestershire's communities since 1923, so a fair while before I was around. We inspire, enable, and deliver community action, and we have teams that cover rural affordable housing, autism and mental health, community development, which is the team that my role as the Community Resilience Officer sits under, as well as a digital equity team and a health and wellbeing team. So there's some really sort of broad areas that we work in across Gloucestershire, but all with the combined aim of fostering that community action. As I mentioned, we work under the umbrella of ACRE as part of one of the 38 rural community councils across England. So there's a nice map on ACRE's website, which I'm happy to share after this presentation, of all of the different rural community councils that are currently acting in England. And it's just quite useful to see, really. So those of you who aren't in Gloucestershire today, where your local rural community council is. As well as working under ACRE, we are also we're a local infrastructure organisation supporting voluntary and community sector organisations with kind of infrastructural support. And so therefore, we're also a member of NAVCA, which stands for the National Association for Voluntary and Community Action. So hopefully that gives a good background of who we are and what we do. So I'm now going to talk about my role in particular. So I've been in post for just over 6 months now. And in those 6 months, I've been very busy going all across Gloucestershire, meeting lots of different people and working with community resilience in loads of different parishes. Some smaller villages of only 500 or so people, up to larger towns such as Tewkesbury or Moreton in Marsh, places such as those. So what community resilience work do we actually do? Well, my biggest project is probably the volunteer flood warden schemes. We run the volunteer flood warden schemes across 4 districts, and they're funded by local authorities. So our volunteers are insured and we get funded by different authorities, including Cotswold District Council, Tewkesbury Borough Council, Cheltenham and Stroud as well. So the flood warden role all stems down to how can, community volunteers help their community prepare for flooding. And this can be done by lots of different sort of techniques and methods that we encourage and train. And it's all about community engagement. How can we engage our community? This could be from anything from social media to leafleting, signposting to different organisations who are working in the space, and just generally sort of almost translating, some of the quite complex advice that can come down from central government and other agencies into our community and disseminating that information through sort of local connections. But as well as the community engagement side of the flood warden role, we also encourage volunteer flood wardens to collect evidence and data of the flooding that is happening in their area. So this could be as simple as, logging the block drain that is on the corner of the road every other day or every week, depending on local need, and making a log and, what actions happened, has this been reported, etc. Just so we find that communities can build up a really solid evidence base to then pass on to the relevant authority. We also encourage volunteer flood wardens to monitor flood risk in their area where they can. So this isn't anything technical, it's just about monitoring river levels, kind of surface water conditions, existing flood defences, and we provide guidance on how they might safely go about doing that. I think it's worth noting that the volunteer flood warden role is incredibly flexible, depending on different areas. A river-lying parish, a flood warden in a river-lying parish will have a very different role and kind of things that they might be able to do compared to a flood warden on a new development that might get more surface water flooding, for example. So aside from volunteer flood wardens, I also offer support with community emergency planning. Now, as I'm sure lots of you are already aware, the government started encouraging people to create community emergency plans after the floods of 2007, really. However, this has recently gained a bit more traction again. And we really recommend that communities kind of look into their community and see, what do we actually already have? Because often, in the face of emergencies, be that flood event or something like COVID, we often find that the community really pulls together, and lots of spontaneous volunteers tend to come forward. But by putting it into a plan before these events happen, it just enables more efficiency and kind of clear communication between the community and the emergency responders. I work with, it's often parish or town councils, but I also work with some community groups as well to develop these plans, talk about whether they'd like to make one from scratch, or sometimes it's about reviewing their current plans, maybe stuff they haven't thought about. I offer support with recruiting volunteers, for example, if maybe they want to consult their community to see what's already in place. And we can help facilitate such activities, as well as sort of provide the connections potentially to other local organisations. So some additional work that we also do that all helps with community resilience is we've recently, new for 2026, launched a community climate action plan toolkit. This is specifically geared more towards parish and town councils, although we've had some community groups interested in this as well. It's a very simple toolkit that basically helps gather all of the resources that are already acting in a community, and utilise this to sort of make one clear action plan for how they might the community organisation might want to foster engagement in their community, specifically looking at what environmental co-benefits may come out of that plan and that toolkit. So it may be something as simple as, you've got a lot of people interested in reading in a village, but maybe there's a bit of people are struggling to afford books or resources. So setting up a community book swap is a good way to engage the community. It's good for the environment and it's good for people. So that's an example of how communities might want to come together to start creating a community climate action plan. And in Gloucestershire, GRCC can help support with this. Now, my final point on GRCC's community resilience work is actually about our wider community development work. Although this isn't resilience focused in the work that I do, my colleagues work with voluntary and community sector organisations, like local organisations, as well as parish and town councils, to provide funding advice, governance advice, community engagement advice. And all of these factors kind of in turn work to create a wider, more resilient community by fostering that social cohesion and engagement and community spirit at the end of the day. And this all has wider knock-on effects onto resilience in the longer term. So I've banged on enough about GRCC's work in Gloucestershire. I'm now going to turn it into a bit more of a national context. And what actually is community resilience? What is the government definition of community resilience? And after searching through the web, this is the definition I found, which states community resilience enabled when the public are empowered to harness local resources and expertise to help themselves and their communities to prepare, respond and recover from disruptive challenges and to plan and adapt to long-term social and environmental change. Now, I think that definition, it does sum it up quite nicely. I can definitely pick a few holes in it if it were. I think it doesn't necessarily say it says the public are empowered, but how do we empower the public? This is extremely subjective and variable across the UK. And at the end of the day, community resilience will mean different things to different people. And the work that we do, it's all about going out into communities, listening to what people want, what problems people face, whether that's flooding or maybe they're worried about sort of antisocial behaviour or something completely different. And it's about using what's already there to facilitate community action of what change people actually want to happen. So yeah, I think it's important to remember these terms that I'm discussing today they can be quite overwhelming to a lot of people, but actually this is about breaking it down, taking it step by step and starting off with just listening to the community and what the community would actually like to see happen. So kind of off a sidetrack from community resilience, I now want to talk about what the role of parish or town councils and community organisations can be in community resilience. So I know lots of you on the call today may be parish councillors, you may be representing a community organisation, or even if you're just a resident and you don't necessarily belong to one of these groups, I think it's still important to highlight the strengths of community organisations and that grassroots level response to resilience. So there was a survey by NALC, so the National Association of Local Councils, and the London School of Economics that came out in September 2025. And this quotes parish or town councils actually as the unsung heroes of emergency response, which I'm sure many of you will be pleased to hear. And as part of this report, it states that over 400 parish and town councils found that 85% provided support during COVID. And I don't think that will come as a surprise to many of you. I think COVID really showcased what local resources can do and can be. And I think often the strengths of these local organisations and these non-statutory sector organisations can often get underrepresented. And it's really important to actually showcase. Additionally, this report also found that rural authorities were actually particularly engaged, and I think that potentially comes down to the sort of small, tight, close communities, tight-knit communities in rural areas compared to larger urban settlements. And in particular, it was parish and town councils in the southwest and southeast were particularly active, which is another interesting find. However, despite this engagement, it was actually also found that over half of parish and town councils didn't actually have a formal community emergency plan. And I think that's a really interesting figure, and it actually shows a bit of a gap where, there's potentially, people to come in and actually start thinking about emergency planning and community emergency planning, as well as spontaneous help in an emergency. So, what are the unique strengths of parish and town councils and community organisations in an emergency? Why are they so special, and why should we be looking at connecting with them? Well, first of all, they provide and represent local perspective of local conditions. The authorities will often be working county-wide, sometimes nationally, and they just don't have the capacity and resource to know each local road inside out. Whereas that is the specialty of local councils and community organisations. They know their community often inside out. So that's a really powerful tool for resilience. Equally, the potential to mobilise local volunteers quickly. They're a recognised body, they're a recognised community leaders and coordinators often. They can represent community need, and they provide that local voice. So I've talked about community resilience and that quite potentially overwhelming term. I'm now going to throw another overwhelming term into the mix, which is inclusivity. So on my presentation, I've written down the Cambridge Dictionary definition of inclusivity, which I think is, it's pretty straightforward. It's pretty simple and straight to the point, which I like. It's all about the fact of including all types of people, things, and treating them all fairly and equally. I mean, it doesn't go into much more detail, but that's what I'll be doing now. So I think hopefully that provides a good starting point on which we can develop. So why is inclusivity important in community resilience? Well, the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, which is the sort of central UN body that gives advice and support with disaster risk reduction internationally, states that disasters do not affect everyone equally. They amplify existing inequalities linked to gender, age, disability, income, and other factors. I think this idea that disasters, they don't necessarily create inequalities, although they can. It's all about they amplify and accentuate those existing inequalities. And it's not any wonder really, because disasters are the time where, as people, as humans, we're often most vulnerable. They're times of panic, stress, and they can even kind of make people who wouldn't necessarily consider themselves to be vulnerable, it can make them vulnerable, for whatever reason linked to a crisis. But they're times of panic and stress, and so it's not any wonder that these existing inequalities are actually made bigger. However, it's important to recognise and address these intersecting risks and vulnerabilities. And this is really essential in building resilient, inclusive, and fair and just societies in the face of increasing disasters. So that was the sort of international perspective, which is still very much relevant to the UK. However, I thought for the benefit of this presentation, which is obviously UK focused, would be to put forward a bit of a case for the UK. We know that inclusivity is important in resilience worldwide, but why is it important in the UK? And so I've got a few statistics here, which I think are quite powerful, really, in showing this case. And these are as follows. So 1 in 5 emergency workers in the UK encounter language barriers on a daily basis, and this directly affects the provision of care that they're able to provide. And so that is a clear disadvantage for people that may come into this country not speaking fluent English, for whatever reason, and that they're, how this can really inhibit access to resources. Similarly, in 2024, 57% of heat-associated deaths occurred in those aged over 85. I mean, as much as that might not necessarily come as a surprise, it still shows how vulnerable that age group is to heat and heat waves. and how that is, it's really important to consider age as a factor when talking about heat emergencies. Furthermore, almost half of Grenfell fire deaths were people with disabilities and children, highlighting these categories of people as particularly vulnerable. In the UK, lower income households are less likely to report storm or flood damage to their homes and maybe less likely to have contents insurance. So that's all about how we spread awareness of reporting techniques, insurance and other flood preparedness and response ideas into society. I think, I mean, these reporting tools aren't necessarily always the most simple. They can be quite complicated. And so it's really important that we kind of share this information on an equal footing so people are able to access this. And finally, people with disabilities accounted for approximately 6 out of every 10 deaths related to COVID-19 in the UK. Now, again, although this might not necessarily come as a surprise, people with disabilities are understandably maybe at increased risk of contracting different viruses or disease. However, it just shows quite how significant disability is in the factor of pandemic. And what can we do as a community to protect our vulnerable people? So I'm now going to go through some factors that you may want to consider when identifying vulnerable people in your community and thinking about inclusive resilience. I'm very aware that this is a very long and overwhelming risk. And I'm not asking people to think about every single one of these in extreme detail, but it's just having them in the back of your mind when dealing with the public, when creating resources to go out in emergencies. Have you thought about whether your place of safety is accessible to people who might use wheelchairs? Are you communicating things in an appropriate way? Do you have a large population of non-English speaking people in your community? Would it be worth having some translated versions of signs to make this accessible? And just thinking about all of these individual factors when you can to try and best prepare your community. So, I mean, these may not be applicable to every single emergency. And in fact, some factors may not always be a vulnerability. For example, you've got a factor such as neurodiversity, which is, one of those buzzwords I think that can be thrown around a lot. And so that encompasses people with autism or ADHD. And although in some circumstances, this can sort of lead to communication difficulties and kind of additional communication needs. In other circumstances, this can also help people think outside the box and, could be a really valuable tool in emergency planning. So it's not necessarily that all of these things mean that, these people will always be more vulnerable. It's all about context and thinking about things when they come up and how you might go about dealing with a situation. However, as we've said in previous slides, disasters and crises will accentuate existing inequalities in a community. And so these factors so we've got physical impairment, sensory impairment, cognitive function impairment, so your sort of psychosocial impairments, medical conditions, older people, young people, people that are pregnant, gender, LGBTQ plus people may be at more of a risk, particularly if they've been sort of shunned from the wider society. They may not feel comfortable seeking support. You've got minority language speakers, people with other communication needs. I mentioned autism as an example before. You've then got asylum seekers, refugees and migrants, people in the travelling community, those in sheltered housing or on the periphery of adult social care. And finally, I think the last one is particularly interesting as tourists. Tourists may not necessarily consider themselves to be stereotypically vulnerable. However, if you're coming into an area and you don't have that local knowledge of the systems in that area, it does make you vulnerable. And I think in Gloucestershire in particular, I know we've got Andy from Bourton on the call. Tourism is a massive factor in particularly in the Cotswolds. And actually, how do we consider tourists and how do we manage tourists in an emergency situation is really key. So I've now banged on about all of the theory. I've hopefully explained resilience and inclusivity and how they interlink in a oh sorry in a easy to understand and hopefully not too overwhelming way. But I know what a lot of people want to hear and want to take away is what steps can we actually do? What can we do today, tomorrow, over the next few months? What can we put into our plans, our policies, to try and make resilience inclusive and trying to build community resilience, from the get-go. So hopefully, I think, I tried to pick a range of different photos on this slide to really accentuate different actions people can take, but I am going to go through them in more consideration here. So this slide is talking through the day-to-day considerations. This is imagining, we're not in a crisis situation. There are no flood alerts. It's, if you like, normal times. What can we do? I think people have a tendency to switch off outside of emergencies. We don't necessarily want to hear about all the horrible things such as pandemics and floods and climate change, when we're not being directly affected. But it's actually a really crucial time to get some of that planning done, to engage your community, to learn more about your community and what's going on. And I've listed some points here that you may want to consider when, we're outside of an emergency. So to kick off, we've got researching and understanding your community. Now, this can be anything from just, Googling your parish, your demographics. You've got resources such as census data. And I know in Gloucestershire, we've got Inform Gloucestershire, which is a county council initiative, and you can look at your parish profile, which gives kind of demographic data about who's in your community. I don't know if that's something that might be rolled out wider and not just in Gloucestershire, but definitely something that's worth having a look. Connecting with local partners. So I've talked a lot about voluntary and community sector organisations. You may well find organisations working in your local area that you didn't know existed. And I think connecting with them, finding out the groups of people that they work with, and how they support is really important. I think quite often when I'm talking to communities about their emergency plan, and I'll mention the value of working with other organisations, and they won't necessarily think of I'm talking about organisations in the widest sense. So your faith organisations, like your local vicar may have really good connections with the community and know-how about particularly, the more vulnerable people who may come to their place of worship for support. I'm talking about kind of creative organisations, art groups, knitting circles, book clubs, sports clubs, all of these places that people come for sort of respite from, their day-to-day working life. And these groups can often have a really good connection and knowledge of the local community. So connecting with them to understand more about your community is a really good way of starting to build that resilience. Following on from this, engagement, what engagement activities could we run, whether that's a summer fete or a kind of an information evening in the village hall. It can be whatever is most relevant to your community. And then talking about accessibility, we've then got accessible signage, other resources, and accessible places of safety. In times when you're not in crisis, it's the best times to start, kind of dotting the I's and crossing the T's on these sorts of things. So, have you got those accessible resources ready? If there's a large non-English speaking population, have you got signs in different languages? Do you have any connections with people that know British Sign Language, and could they be of support in an emergency, for example? Accessible places of safety are things you often may already be thinking about in community buildings. So, is your village hall got a wheelchair access? Does it have a disabled toilet? If not, are there any pots of funding you could tap into to help facilitate this and help facilitate the accessibility needs? Um, it's thinking about all of these different things and just step by step thinking about what your community already has and what may be a good idea to either invest in or just learn more about. The next step is human-centered approach to crisis preparedness. Now, this is all about getting and hearing local voices. It means that organisations and systems empower people to prepare personalised solutions before an emergency, which links on to the next point about personal emergency plans. It's as well as having community-wide emergency plans, it's a great idea to encourage people to make their own personal plans. So they can think about things such as personal medication that they might need, even for thinking about children, things as simple as packing their comfort blanket or their, a cuddly toy for them in an emergency grab bag can really help just, keep morale and account for different individuals' needs in an emergency. It doesn't have to be anything technical. And on the community level, I don't necessarily think it should be anything technical. It's all about using what you already have with the limited funds that we do have. And the last one there, it's kind of linking onto that personal emergency plans, is the priority services register. So each utility company will have a priority services register. And if you are vulnerable and eligible to apply, it's really important that you do. This means that, for example, if there's a water outage, if you're vulnerable and this could affect you disproportionately compared to other members of the community, you will get prioritised. And so this is something I share often with like my volunteer flood wardens and the communities I work with on emergency planning, is to sign up and get people to sign up to the priority services register and spread that awareness. So the next slide I'm going to talk about is during an emergency. So we've talked about in the before phase, in that those normal times. But during an emergency, how can we keep that inclusive community resilience going? So we've got accessible messaging, which is similar to the accessible resources and signs that I talked about before. And again, ensuring places of safety are accessible. I think this point is slightly different to the accessible places of safety on the previous slide, in an emergency situation, say a flood. Places of safety may become inaccessible. So you may have, a wheelchair access ramp, but if a tree's come down, this may not then be accessible. And this is not presuming that people in your community can then get rid of that tree or debris or whatever, but it's about highlighting that as a key point and a key thing that needs to be dealt with, and then translating this and communicating this to the people that can do that task. So, whether that's the emergency services or potentially a local volunteer, such as a local farmer, if that's something you're able to tap into, but in particularly highlighting, that access problem to the emergency services is a key role that communities can play. Finally, again, coordinating with local partners and emergency responders. So if you have got a sort of a group in your community that it takes a bit of a lead on a community emergency response, so often I encourage people to have a bit of a community emergency team. Having that communication with local partners is absolutely key. And knowing when to signpost and escalate a situation. The community emergency planning does in no way take away the responsibility from those statutory organisations. It's all about using what we already have. And it's actually knowing when to signpost and escalate a situation is a key skill to have. To obviously look after the welfare of the community emergency team and the community, but make sure things are done safely and appropriately in the system. And so knowing when to escalate that is key. I've then put adopting a buddy system, so with particularly with vulnerable people in your area who may not be comfortable to sort of go about things by themselves, potentially connecting them with local neighbours who are willing to help and support is a really good option. And then finally, welfare support, as we've already established and we all know. Um, Emergencies are extremely stressful and anxiety-inducing situations for everybody, particularly those most vulnerable. So just offering that welfare support is a really key way that we can help and support people in an emergency. So then finally, we've got after emergency, and these are all similar points to the previously mentioned points, but it's all about the evaluation and the feedback and the aftermath and the clear up of the emergency. So again, connecting with those local organisations to provide practical or emotional support. This is what organisations such as the Red Cross or victim support, this is what they do. This is their bread and butter, and utilise that is a really good thing to tap into. Encouraging and supporting people with taking photos of damage for insurance claims or reporting to authorities. Again, people may not, a lot of things are online at the moment, and you may have people in your community who don't feel comfortable kind of using their phone to do stuff like that. So, providing that help and support where you can. Regularly checking in and offering emotional reassurance is absolutely key. Like I said, the mental health impacts of emergencies it can be really severe. Assisting with cleanup where possible and arranging professional help when necessary is absolutely important. And finally, I've got that human-centered approach again, and that's all about hearing local perspectives, keeping things personal, and how did it affect people in your community, and how can we encourage change, and what things need to be changed in your plan. Are the volunteers that came forward that maybe you didn't know about, or are the resources that we didn't have that would be useful? It's all about evaluation. So finally, and this is my last slide, as I'm sure you'll all be sick of hearing me talk now. Um, but I'll quite often do presentations such as this, or I'll be talking about emergency plans, and people will want to know what they can do today, what you can do right now that can then affect change, in the next few days, and those low-hanging fruit, if you will. And I've tried to list a few here, which I think are hopefully accessible to most of you on the call today. That with limited funds available, time capacity increasingly being stretched, we all want those quick wins to help us kind of gain momentum, and particularly when it comes to quite a complex and overwhelming topics such as building inclusive community resilience. So the first key ones that I've written down here are connecting with your local organisations. And a really good way to do this is to get in touch with your local ACRE member, so Action for Communities in Rural England member, such as GRCC in Gloucestershire, or similarly a local NAVCA member who may be able to offer support. Now I'll send out the links to these organisations after this call, so you can all go and have a look and see what support is available on offer in your local area. It's a really great way to sort of get in contact with people that are already doing lots of this work in your area, and it can essentially save a lot of legwork on your behalf. Secondly, starting to research your community, like look at that census data. Look at your parish profile if you can find one, read news articles and see what is going about, word of mouth, have conversations with people, see what your community wants to see happen, see what's most important to them, and see what needs might come about. Do you have a large like migrant population? Do you have a significant elderly population, or are there a lot of young families? And how can we adapt our emergency response to fit this? And then next, starting to prepare an emergency grab bag. So this is just a personal bag that you have that it might have a first aid kit, as we can see on the screen there, first aid kit, high vis, a torch, whatever you need. I mentioned, if you've got young children, having some toys in there, it might seem silly, but it can actually be really important in just keeping calm and and being able to manage the situation the best you can. And this is why preparation is so important. Sharing information about the priority services register is a great way to just start off providing support to your vulnerable residents, making sure that they're on that register and that they will get seen to as fast as they can by the authorities. And in the case of a power outage or a water outage, and this is particularly key if you have people whose potentially their medical equipment relies on electricity, for example. And finally, planning a low-cost engagement event is a great way to sort of start fostering that engagement. And I mean, this could be anything from an online event, if that's relevant to your community, some leaflet dropping, doing a drop-in at a community centre or a village hall to signpost people and give people advice. Or even, giving a talk with a local society or sports club or art club or whatever, just to start engaging people in resilience, looking at what's already happening and what might want to be done in the future. So thanks for listening to my presentation today. I hope that has been of interest and has provided you with lots of things to think about and hopefully not, been too overwhelming. I know resilience and inclusion can both be quite difficult topics to think about. However, I think I want my leaving statement to be that you do not have to do everything I've mentioned on these PowerPoints. It's about taking small steps towards resilience and doing what we can when we can with the funding and time we have available. And that one more community building that's made accessible, or one interaction with a sign language interpreter and getting them on board, it just takes one step to make that a little bit more inclusive. And so I hope that has been helpful. My contact details are on the presentation there. So yeah, please have a look and get in contact with me if you need anything. I know I'm happy to take some questions. I know I've only got about 10 minutes left, and I don't know if there's anything in the chat, but yeah, no.
Lucy, thank you so much. That was really, really impressive, actually. So practical, so helpful, and so informative for people who may not have started thinking about this yet. So thank you very much. If you could kindly stop sharing your screen, Lucy, then we'll
Yes,
be
of
able to
course.
see all the
Sorry.
people with questions. The first one I can see is from Helen Cook. So Helen, please go ahead.
Hi, thanks Lucy for your presentation. That was great. I'm part of an organization called the Resilience Web, and we do a lot of things. We're an online directory, and we also run events in person, which we're doing currently with an event series called How Resilient is Cambridge, specifically looking at 6 topics in Cambridge. And we're specifically interested actually in the not low-hanging fruit, right? And like how can we persuade councils to change policies that are going to, better help us be prepared for the emergencies that we know are coming. And my question for you is, what's the best way to approach councils to try to have these sorts of things changed? So, for example, like with flooding, to become more of a sponge city, or to discourage paving. With food, perhaps to encourage more food banks and implement more food stores. All of these sorts of things that could potentially help. So.
No, yeah, that's a really good question, Helen. And I think yeah, it's a big question. There's lots of things that could be done. I think off the top of my head, particularly from my experience in Gloucestershire, the first thing I'd mention is that when it comes to emergency planning in particular, this all will happen within the realm of the LRF. So I don't know if you're familiar with the Local Resilience Forum.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I don't know if you kind of are connected in with them about resilience, but it would be great. I think that's a great place to start when it comes to, kind of operational capabilities and
Yeah.
what is happening. With regards to policy changes, obviously that will happen on a sort of like a political basis essentially. And I think, getting change from central government and local government at the end is probably one of the most challenging things that, we're constantly kind of butting up on. Um, to be honest, I think from the work that we do and the perspective that we can provide, gaining that community engagement and that interest from the community and from the grassroots level, is a really good way of fostering engagement and interest, and then kind of channeling that through district councillors or county councillors to then advocate for that change at a higher level.
Mhm.
That's certainly what we kind of try and encourage our volunteers, for example, to do.
Yeah.
Because, as a charity, we're apolitical, we have to remain neutral when it comes to policies. However, I'm always sharing kind of different consultations with my volunteers and kind of encouraging education and engagement from the wider community. So then hopefully that channels up, if that makes sense. And it's all about the work we do is all about bottom up and getting community voices heard. I hope that helps and makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah, that is really helpful. Yeah, thank you for that.
It's okay.
Okay, Sarah, please.
Um, Thank you. You have the previous lady, you've just covered it actually, but I'll raise it anyway. Local resilience forums. In Kent, we have a very active Kent Resilience Forum. And in my area, which is at the moment Tunbridge and Morling, there is an officer that comes and round to speak to parish councils about their resilience planning, and we're encouraging all parish councils to get from a very simple to however complex they want it to be a resilience plan in place. It's slow, but I would certainly encourage Helen from the Cambridge Web or the Resilience Web rather, to also liaise with their local ALC for parish council buy-in as well.
Absolutely, Sarah. Really, really important point. In Gloucestershire, I think I'd say we have a pretty good actually relationship between the local resilience forum and those legal, the people with the legal duties to respond in emergency and ultimately protect life. And the voluntary sector, I personally, representing GRCC, we have a few subgroups. So we've got a voluntary sector subgroup where people such as the British Red Cross and React, as well as like local organisations, all come together to discuss how the voluntary sector can support with those more local connections, how they can support the statutory responders. And then as well, we also have a community resilience subgroup, which kind of works with, again, how we can interact with the community and collaborate with organisations such as ourselves who have those local connections. And like you say, working with the district council emergency planning officers, for example, to encourage parish and town councils and other community groups in non-parished areas, for example, to actually create emergency plans and offer support with that. I know in Gloucestershire there's been quite a good feedback by having us as a charity and an impartial body having that influence. I think a lot of people will be quite hesitant when it comes to dealing with the district council, but by having us as sort of additional support and being able to run workshops, for example, on specific points. So I've talked about inclusivity a lot today. We can run like specific workshops on different things people have interests in with regards to resilience. And yeah, we've had a lot of positive feedback about that. And I know there's lots of other organisations such as Communities Prepared, which I'm sure you might be familiar with, working in that. And yeah, I think that can be a really valuable resource to tap into.
Thank you.
Andrew, your turn.
Thank you. Well done, Lucy. That was cracking. And very good to meet you the other day in person as well. Um, Cambridgeshire, we've been doing great collaboration, doing a lot of work in East Anglia. I was actually speaking to somebody at the Cambridgeshire Association of Local Councils only yesterday. Seems like only yesterday. So I will send stuff that we're pulling together around people we're already connected. Helen, we've got email contact, somebody called Charlie Barty King. Is he? That's all. Probably he's the email contact I've got already. So he can run, but he can't hide. I'll send it to him. The other question was that, Lucy, you mentioned a climate action toolkit. Is this the same toolkit that the County Association, that GBC publish, or is it a different one?
No, it's a different one. So it's our own like personal toolkit from GRCC that we're offering. It's focused in Gloucestershire specifically. So it's just for Gloucestershire communities, and it's also kind of using the networks that we have and the support we can offer. Like I said, we can have discussions with local organisations to sort of work with them and offer support on community consultation facilitation. We can offer. And it's about, using what's already happening in the community and helping them essentially get everything lined up. And that's the support that we can offer with the Community Climate Action Plan.
Is that something that's successful through your website, or do they need to be in touch with you?
No, they'll have to be in touch with us. Like I said, it's just it's newly launched actually in 2026. We've done a few information sessions for Gloucestershire parish and town councils. And yeah, it's kind of we're seeing what the feedback would be like. But yeah, it's newly launched, and they'll to access they'll need to be contacted by us. I believe there's some information on our website, but I'm happy to send out email addresses and stuff. If you drop me an email, anybody who's interested on the call, drop me an email, then I'm happy to have a conversation.
I mean, Gloucestershire County Council as a body was a little bit slow off the mark on some of these issues, but it's now picked up speed, and it's got a network. When they started, they didn't include the town and parish councils in there, but anyway, that's now been fixed. Not by me, I hasten to add, by somebody else. But every county is different, and I imagine every resilience forum is going to be different as well. We looked into back in East Anglia, we looked at what templates for emergency planning were being used. And for Norfolk, they've got one which is not dissimilar, but slightly changed from the government template, which published in 2016. The one Essex Resilience Forum are using one from Nottinghamshire. So what that tells me, well, that's fine. What that tells me is there isn't an updated template. It's covering a lot of the hazards which the government is now beginning to publicise separately. That could be useful across the piece, and so we're going to speak to some resilience forums in East Anglia as well to get their views on this. Because everywhere is different, everywhere will have different issues. But I mean, wildflowers, droughts, floods, all of these things are as likely to happen to any of us now. Heat waves certainly. Government has published it in one place, but it's not put it in the emergency plan template. So we're joining the dots.
Lucy, I'm just going through any questions in the chat, and one of them is asking just how unique are you? In other words, how many of the other RCCs have a community resilience officer? Do you find that you're all on your own, or are you just one of many?
So I know for a fact there's multiple. I can't off the top of my head say how many specifically there are. However, I know that if you go onto your local RCC's website, it will clearly say the support that they offer. And if it still is a bit uncertain, then definitely get in touch with them and see. I know. I mean, community resilience, like I said, is my role's is on its own. It's very specific. But community development, on a wider level is absolutely is widespread across the RCCs, and lots of RCCs are able to offer funding and governance advice, support with running community buildings, for example, connecting with your local voluntary and community sector organisations. So absolutely get in touch with them, and I know that, like, I believe in Oxfordshire and some other places. I can't think off the top of my head. There are definitely community resilience officers, about, and definitely have a look on the website and see what support they offer.
I think you've also in there answered another point from Rob Cheeseman in Dorset, which was there's lots of advice but no indication of funding. But you were saying that the GRCC or other RCCs may well have information about funding.
Yeah, so we can, like I said, we're a charity and require funding to run ourselves. Like I said, most of my role tends to be funded by the local authority, but we can also offer charged for services on like bespoke bases. We can offer, so yeah, my colleagues in the community development team offer funding advice to local community organisations. They can they can't write your funding applications for you, but they can be a critical friend to funding applications and sort of help assist where necessary. So yeah, we offer a lot of that kind of support to small grassroots organisations in Gloucestershire, and I know there's been lots of really positive feedback to the team.
Right. Well, I don't see any other hands raised, so let me say again, thank you so much for what I think is going to be one of those lectures or presentations that you look back in a year or two's time and you see that you've really started the ball rolling, and there's a whole bunch of activities stemming from this meeting. So thanks so much, Lucy.
Well, no, I hope so, and I welcome people to keep in touch and let me know if it comes to anything. So yeah, great to meet you all. Thank you.
And I just,
See you soon.
an extraordinary example of foresight. I've worked out what's going to happen next week. So those of you who haven't looked at our program, we're going to be talked to next week all about drones and photography. And I particularly asked this question of a local person about doing overhead flights of villages and parishes to see at night what the infrared leakage is, and to show people just where their houses are short of information or insulation. And there are lots of other uses that drones can be put to nowadays to really help things going. I know that we really got things going in Somerset when we had a drone go up and take a look at the nature reserve once a month and sort of just photographed how it was developing. So useful stuff. Do come and join us next week, please, if you want to find out more about what can be done in the world of air-to-air flying. And in the meantime, have a great week. And Lucy, thank you so much. We'll publish all of your presentation and your links and your contact information on the knowledge base. Take care, everybody. Thank you
Thanks
so
very
much.
much. That's great.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Bye.